土地問題從來都係香港管治嘅核心課題。呢一堂我哋請嚟中文大學嘅朱偉先教授，為我哋回顧香港殖民地喺19世紀末期以至20世紀初期嘅土地房屋政策。喺呢一堂裏邊，佢會同我哋分析殖民地政府面對危機嘅時候，點樣平衡唔同嘅持份者利益，滿足市民嘅住屋需求，以及維持對市場嘅適度監管。
I'm Cecilia Chu, Associate Professor in the School of Architecture at the Chinese University of Hong Kong. In this lecture, I'd like to discuss how the study of urban crises and their aftermaths may enrich our understanding of history and forms of development of a city. We will begin with a few framing questions. How do disaster events affect different populations of a city? How are decisions made around crisis reliefs by the government and other agencies? What kinds of new knowledge are being generated from these processes? And how may such knowledge contribute to planning and urban governance? In the following, I will explore these questions by revisiting 3 pivotal events in Hong Kong's history in which urban crises reshaped the future course of the city between the late 19th and early 20th centuries. The first event is the outbreak of bubonic plague in 1894, which killed over 2,000 people over one summer, and eventually led to the first large-scale urban renewal scheme in the district of Taiping Shan on Hong Kong Island. The second event was a fatal building collapse in Central in 1901, which resulted in a prolonged investigation of the Public Works Department and restructuring of the unit. Finally, we will examine a housing crisis in the early 1920s, when intensifying property speculation led to a huge rent hike across the city, forcing the government to impose the first ever rent control law to cool down the housing market. Despite that efforts had been made to prevent the recurrence of similar disasters in the future, many of the improvement schemes and regulations introduced did not quite succeed according to the original plans, thanks to the opposition from various parties with vested interest in the property market. By tracing the dynamics of the 3 events, this talk will also discuss some of the changing approaches to planning and development in Hong Kong, and how these approaches played a role in constructing the discourses about the city and its people in the later periods. Let's first take a look at how Hong Kong looked like in the late 19th century. Historians have shown us that from early on, Chinese and Europeans lived separate lives in different parts of the city. Wealthy British and European merchants, for example, stayed mainly at the mid-level and the peak, which was designated as a European reservation since the 1880s. Like other colonies at the time, the rationale for segregation was that Europeans were not used to the tropical climate and therefore needed to stay at a higher altitude with cooler temperature to preserve their health and well-being. The Chinese, including a majority of the working population, were living in the lower part of the city in crowded tenements, or the so-called tonglao, translated as Chinese houses. Now, it's interesting to point out that although these buildings were often criticized for their poor quality and insanitary conditions, many landlords, including not only Chinese but also Europeans, Parsis, and other ethnic groups with capital, actually preferred to invest on these properties. This is because legally, Chinese buildings could be subdivided and rented to multiple families, and therefore could generate better investment returns, more than the substantially built European houses. The situation was supported by Hong Kong's land policy, which kept a strict limit on land supply to allow the government to get more returns from land auctions and crown rents. This high land price system created a thriving and competitive land market, but at the same time, it also encouraged property speculation, high rents, and overcrowding. The problem was worst in the Taiping Shan area, where many low-income Chinese workers had little choice but to share bed spaces in congested tenements. Common assumptions about the plague in 1894 are that it was a huge shock to Hong Kong, not only because of the high death toll, but also of the devastating impact on the economy. In reality, however, colonial doctors had for years been warning about the danger of disease outbreaks in the crowded tenements. Time over time, they had pushed for tighter building regulations to improve these buildings, but their suggestions were repeatedly ignored by the landlords and the colonial administrators themselves because of worries that too much regulations would drive away private investment and public revenue. The plague certainly created a crisis of legitimacy for the government, which was expected to protect the lives and well-being of its colonial subjects. After the disease subsided, a commission was set up to consider how to improve the sanitary conditions of Taiping Shan. It was concluded that the best solution was to demolish all the existing buildings and replan the entire area with better built tenements, along with ample open space and a modern drainage and water supply system. To do this, 10 acres of land would be resumed with compensation paid to property owners. The proposal led to an immediate outcry amongst all the landlords, not only the ones in Taiping Shan, but those in other parts of Hong Kong. They argue that, besides a few exceptions, most houses in Taiping Shan could be made healthy by minor alterations. They also pointed out that the wholesale demolition of the district would further reduce the housing stock and therefore even worsened overcrowding and health conditions. But most importantly, these landlords claimed that if the demolition went ahead, the project would violate the fundamental principles of the housing market, which was a cornerstone of Hong Kong's colonial capitalist economy. Rather than wasting public money to destroy buildings, the government should instead provide rent relief to property owners to carry out building improvement works. Now, in hindsight, we may see these suggestions to be self-serving. Nevertheless, they point to some interesting aspects of how investment practice continued to shape urban development in early Hong Kong. The first is the highly mixed patterns of property ownership. Although Taiping Shan has often been referred to as a Chinese area, it was a hunting ground for property speculators that cut across races and ethnicities. This was revealed in a property listing published after the plague outbreak, showing that almost 1/3 of the landlords there were non-Chinese, including Europeans, Indians, Parsis, and Portuguese, as well as several major commercial firms and charity organizations. The list also showed that most of the houses were built around the late 1870s and early 1880s, which was a period that corresponded with intense property speculation. A majority of the buildings were subdivided as coolie houses, which was the most demanded type of rental property. As shown in a government report before the plague, many of these buildings were in very bad conditions and some were partially collapsed. A question here is, why the buildings, which were still relatively new, were left in such bad conditions? One might presume that as speculative tenements that were built to maximize short-term rental profits, their owners would not want to spend much money to upkeep them. Another explanation was that many owners had subdivided their lots and sold them out as sections without registration records, leading to a situation in which some section holders did not pay Crown rent, and in other cases, with no one taking care of other parts of the lot. These situations were documented in the Hong Kong Land Commission report, which showed that over the years, many houses in the city had been built upon one lot, owned by different people who ignored the original lot boundaries and encroached upon each other illegally. So it was likely that the government was troubled by the loss of control over land sales and Crown rent income in Taiping Shan. The redevelopment, therefore, would allow it to start afresh by tightening planning control, regularizing land subdivisions, and enforcing proper registration of house owners who would pay land rents and taxes on time. From this perspective, the replanning of Taiping Shan was not just a benevolent project for improving public health, as we were often told in familiar narratives. What it represents is the emergence of a new planning rationality towards urban development, a balancing act to strengthen the government's legitimacy and to maximize land revenue. However, these efforts did not go so smoothly because of the inherent contradictions within the land economy in Hong Kong. In the next part of this lecture, we will begin by looking further into these contradictions in the aftermath of the plague and visiting another crisis that occurred around the same period.